but that's better than nothing. Spooky. Slideshow. We are recording. Okay. Oh yeah, it records automatically now. Great. Okay. All right, let me make sure. Hello. Yeah. I didn't even turn the camera on, my bad. Boop. Okay. Our tech is good to go, in theory. Despite our weird, ugly color. I'll try not to. Yeah, I'll try not to touch anything while we're here. All right, folks. Well, welcome back. This is our 7th edition of Building Better Media Habits. I am, of course, your guide through this conversation, Dr. Corey Barker from Bradley. And it's October, and that means somehow we have another pretty significant election season on our hands. Midterm elections just a month away, almost to the day, I think. And so I was interested in what's going on with misinformation and disinformation, specifically related to this election cycle. This is obviously a topic that comes up essentially every time we have an election, which is, generally every year now. There's something happening at the state or national level every November, right? And with primaries in the spring, it's always in the ether. But with such a major election cycle coming up, I thought it would be good to kind of check in on what's out there misinformation wise, what some of the tech companies are doing, and potentially some of the changes that are different between now and even 2020. And in theory, as always, like, what can we do about it, if anything? So starting big picture, I wanted to underline that people, unsurprisingly, when surveyed or when asked, are generally concerned about the spread of misinformation or disinformation. Of course, to very quickly distinguish between the two, misinformation is false information that is circulated potentially without malice or intent, right? That someone might just share something not knowing that it's false, whereas disinformation is false information that someone is sharing purposely to persuade or change the minds of people with false info. So a recent Pew survey that then was reported on by the New York Times from just recently in 2022, late summer, early fall, top threats around the world. So this was not an article that was just about mis and disinformation, but things that people are generally worried about worldwide. They eventually, got down to United States and things like that. We'll look at another example from this survey in a second, but you can see that after global climate change, the spread of false information was the second biggest threat in people's minds at the major threat level. And you can see that when you add those two categories together, 94% of folks surveyed suggested that it is a issue or a threat to, society, to the human race, not just like to democracy, but in general, right? Which essentially puts it right there with global climate change as something that's at the front of minds, right? And naturally, you could even argue that all of these categories intersect with mis and disinformation or false information, right? So all of the other four, we obviously see circulating mis and disinformation about the climate, right? We see it certainly about the spread of infectious disease. We see it in relation to the economy, and we see it in relation to cyber attacks and cybersecurity. So in many ways, all five of these are interconnected, but they certainly overlap with the spread of false info online. For those of us here in the audience, are you any reactions to this? Surprised to see spread of false information this high up? Yeah. Because that reflects reality, that people feel that strongly about it. Yeah. Well, and I think, I'm confident that there are similar surveys or questions that have been asked over time. And clearly, if we're looking at it just on a line graph or a bar chart, right, like the line or bars are going upward as far as how people are concerned, or the degree at which people are concerned about this. And I would suspect that it's gone up dramatically over the last 5 to 10 years, right? I think naturally the online piece, automatically boxes us into a certain, period of time. But I think generally the spread of false information writ large, online, on TV, whatever, that is a very, very modern concern, right? And I think that people, whether they're feeling it immediately or seeing stories all the time, which is something that we're going to talk about, it is in our minds, right? And this is not just in America, right? I think sometimes this gets couched, especially by folks in the United States. When people downplay this conversation, it's often posited as sort of liberal hysteria in reaction to Trump being elected, or certain, policies and things that have happened in American politics. But this is a concern that people have all across the world. And there are a number of examples of extreme circulation of false information related to elections in other countries, right? Brazil having a huge election right now, and that has been rife with misinformation and disinformation from the outset. And they're going to a runoff, and it will probably be even worse as they lead into the runoff. Bringing it down to America, same questions, or same survey, I should say. Obviously, they asked people how they leaned politically, just to illustrate, the differences. The starkest representation of the political differences there is how folks on the proverbial other sides of the aisle view climate change, which to me was really shocking, right? To see that basically only 22-23% of folks who identify as Republican or lean Republican believe that climate change is an issue or a major threat. But in our area that we're talking about tonight, false spread of information or spread of false information, it's actually not that far apart, right? Some of them are closer, right? People are obviously always concerned about the global economy. Generally speaking, there's concern about Russia as a broad, power and influence in the United States. But you can see that it's pretty close together, right? A little over 60, almost 80% in contrast there, which illustrates that people all across the political spectrum in the United States view this as an issue. Obviously, there's a partisan view of as soon as you call something false, that becomes immediately partisan in a lot of ways, right? That, as we'll get into, if people are refusing to acknowledge the, results of an election, they are then going to see any subsequent information that is theoretically confirming that election as false, right? So that is completely ideological, but it still illustrates people really do care about this stuff. So that sets the table for obviously a really complicated environment online, especially when we have these massive flashpoints like elections. Obviously we see misinformation and disinformation circulate all the time, but it's obviously something that is really important in and around elections because of the stakes of elections. One thing that I think is really interesting to consider in relation to those surveys, right, is the amount of reporting on this topic, right? That major news sources in the United States and around the world have taken it upon themselves to talk about this a lot more than they did, again, 10 years ago, even 8 years ago, right? If you think back to the 2014 midterms, I don't remember like misinformation being at the top of the list of the conversation about what was happening leading into the 2014 midterms in the way that it is a big part of the discourse now. So that's something that I keep thinking about, even in having these sessions, is if you are seeing headlines like this regularly, right? So this is from Monday, from a couple of days ago, a report from the FBI that Russia and China are promoting, voting misinformation on various social platforms, right? Underlining that, as the third paragraph here says, that recent Russian influence operations, which have been more pronounced than the Chinese, typically involve amplifying conversations that Americans have on social media or other platforms rather than creating new content. And it essentially said that in some ways, China disinformation agents were using the quote unquote Russian playbook, right, that we saw allegedly in 2016. So almost every week, right, especially leading into election season, which, feels like all the time, there are stories like this. And there are, I did a survey just quickly of stories from this month, right, from major news sources, whether we're talking about the Washington Post, Axios, or NBC. These are just a cross section of really great reports about what's happening out there. And I want to talk about some of the specifics within these articles, or what they're covering, what phenomenon they're covering. But I do wonder what the effect of seeing articles like this in the news all the time, that there is misinformation out there, or that people fall victim to misinformation, and whether or not that creates not necessarily a false sense, but like a heightened awareness of the fact that, there are people in your social circles or people that you disagree with who are potentially falling victim to false information online. How do we feel about that? How much effect do we think coverage of this issue shapes the fact that people are thinking about it and assuming that people in their networks are falling victim to this stuff?
I think it's causing them to turn off what they had. With that, but that's an area there that you can't really count on.
Yeah.
Any accurate information, so you kind of quit looking.
Yeah, I think there's one effect there, right, where and you see that in research across media and across information in general, right, that there's a level of like negativity and cynicism that may set in that eventually then leads people to just tune out, right? Obviously, as we even talked about last time when we met in September, there's a huge swath of people who just don't participate in this stuff at all, not by active choice, because they, have come accustomed to the fact that thinking everything is fake, but just they've never really participated. They don't view, political news as important to them or whatever. But then there is obviously a subsection of people who eventually start to see this stuff as it's all false or partially false or entirely agenda driven in a way that makes them just opt out of news and information in a conventional sense, right? And I think to some extent you also see that in folks at the early stages of it, right? Like in talking to college students, this is not to suggest that they're not informed, but I think what happens is this kind of stuff is just in the ether, right? When you ask questions about misinformation or disinformation or, challenges maybe facing the news, this is what they immediately go to, and can't necessarily like point to specific examples that where they've ever even encountered it. They just assume that everything they see online is to some degree not legitimate when it's in the news, especially in the political context, which is often where they think of news and they think that's like politics, right? I don't think that that was necessarily the case 10 years ago. I don't think that was necessarily the case when people turned on television news 30 years ago or picked up a newspaper, right? That you didn't pick it up automatically assuming that most of what you read in there was probably not true, right? There's just an overall sense now that it's not accurate. Any other thoughts on that before we?
See that where people would just tune it out, basically, which then they're not getting any information.
Yeah.
So how are they making, I don't know, legit decisions on it?
Right.
Vote or whatever the case may be.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that it is in some ways a self-fulfilling engine of apathy and cynicism and like inaction, right? Where you eventually feel like that the information that you're getting is flawed to some degree, and you change your media diet or your information diet based on that, right? And that then shapes your level of civic engagement or civic awareness, right? Which then only probably furthers, the further you get away from caring about what's happening around you, the less likely you are to read about what's happening around you. And the less likely you are to read about it, the less likely you are to care, right? It's just this never-ending cycle that creates, I think, really interesting dynamics that is hard to survey over, especially without a long period of research. But I get that sense anecdotally, right? And I'm just one person, but doing enough of this now, I feel like that is a part of this, right? That a lot of people who probably answered that survey felt like, yes, this absolutely is a problem. And it also affects what I even read or how I consume, right? So I think when we get to the end of today, we'll come back to actually something you mentioned there about like the kind of negativity of this and how that affects people, and maybe how a turn towards more positivity actually in recent surveys helps, but doesn't really like solve any of these issues. But in any event, I think the significance of the reporting about misinformation and disinformation is important, right? But it does, I think, also frame or color how people are thinking about this. So what about specific things that are out there right now that is being covered in the news and addressed by, even agencies like the FBI, different, think tanks and international initiatives? What type of dis and misinformation is circulating? Obviously, the holdover effects of the 2020 election, especially at the presidential level, are deeply, embedded into this campaign and conversations about this campaign. There's actually a Washington Post story that went up today after I was already done with my slides that noted that over half of the folks who are running for office as Republicans in the 2022 election, like up and down the ballot, have publicly stated, skepticism or outright denial of the results of the 2020 election. So more than half of the folks running for office are saying publicly that on some level they don't believe that the 2020 election was fair or legitimate. So how does that trickle onto social media? Unsurprisingly, if we focus on something like social media, and this is reporting from the New York Times from earlier this fall, stolen election was mentioned 325,000 times on Twitter from June 19th to July 19th. And that's of this year, right? Not of even last year, right? And that was up nearly 900% from the same period in 2020. On the video sharing site Rumble, which generally hosts more conservative and some outright, conspiratorial thinkers and public speakers, videos with the term "Stop the Steal" or "Stolen Election" and other claims of election fraud have been among the most popular. In May, such posts attracted 2.5 million viewers, more than triple the total from a year earlier, according to a digital analytics firm. Unsurprisingly, more recently, as we're getting closer to elections, we've sort of pivoted away from not just the 2020 election was stolen or rigged or faulty, but now what are we going to do to stop that from happening this time, right? "Quote unquote, stop that." So misinformation around the integrity of voting, that's kind of been the pivot in these circles. So more conspiracy circle theories are circulating online about individuals submitting fraudulent ballots, about voting machines being rigged to favor Democrats, and about election officials switching the kinds of pins that voters must use to mark ballots in order to confuse them. And you can see even in the next section here how that has really trickled into quote unquote real life, right? I like to not say that there's any division between the internet or social media in real life, because obviously we see that how they are deeply, deeply embedded with stuff like this, with not only our daily interactions, but significant events like, you know, the insurrection or the riot at the Capitol, whatever you want to call it, on January 6th. So online conversations have also been dominated by calls for voters to act against apparent election fraud. In response, some people have organized citizen policing of voting with stakeouts of polling stations and demands of information about voter rolls in their counties. Civil rights groups widely criticize poll watching, which they say can intimidate voters, particularly immigrants, and at sites in communities of color. So from July 27th to August 3rd of this year, the second most shared tweet about the midterms was a photo of people staking out a ballot box with a message that, quote, residents are determined to safeguard the drop boxes, according to Signal, which is like a digital analytics firm. Among those who shared it was Dinesh D'Souza, the creator of 2000 Miles, extreme right wing thinker, quote unquote, who has 2.4 million followers on Twitter. And that is illustrated in some of these other headlines. If I go back one, there's tons of these stories, like the one at the top, where on a local level, people who just work elections, right, who are just there volunteering their time to make sure that elections run as smoothly as possible, are being intimidating, being harassed, being threatened. And we haven't even gotten to the actual election cycle. And there's tons of data, you know, surveying of those people who say they're going to not do this anymore, that they're, you know, hopefully going to make through 2022, and then they're never going to volunteer for an election again, right? Unsurprisingly, you know, this trickles down to actual laws, right? So as we know, many states have enacted changes to their laws that best describe restrict voting access. At least 18 states have done that since the beginning of 2021. And there's tons of misinformation and disinformation out there about those particular laws, how they get enacted. And we'll look at some examples of how that even trickles into communication, like the day before an election, right? And how last minute attempts to dissuade people from voting or trying to get people to think that they can vote in ways that they can't, right? So a lot of these disinformation campaigns work in these states where maybe in 2020, you could vote by mail because of changing rules at the time with the pandemic and everything like that. A lot of those vote by mail programs have been rolled back. And what is happening then is people are getting text messages or seeing on social media that they can still vote by mail, right? And that they shouldn't worry about trying to go to the polls on election day or whatever. So we're actually seeing, you know, a rollback of actual laws and then a coordinated disinformation campaign that tries to remind people of what it was like before to prevent them from voting under the new system, right? Along with that, unsurprisingly, we're seeing the proliferation of what we can broadly call, you know, culture war related topics, the things about identity that make people really upset, right? For one reason or another, not that, you know, people get upset about everything, but so just an example here, a month after Florida passed legislation that prohibits classroom discussion or instruction about sexual orientation and gender identity, which the Republican governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, signed into law in March, the volume of tweets falsely linking gay and transgender individuals to pedophilia soared. For example, language claiming that gay people and transgender people were, quote, grooming children for abuse increased 406% on Twitter in April, according to a study by the Human Rights Campaign and the Center for Countering Digital Hate, right? So we've seen things like this, you know, around Florida's, quote unquote, you know, don't say gay bill, the rise of people using the word grooming and the concept of grooming to create disinformation and hate around gay and transgender people. We've seen similar things connected to, the rolling back of abortion rights as a result of the Dobbs decision over the summer, right? So these things that are really important from a legislative perspective, right? Obviously, there's tons of misinformation that floats into social media and the internet about them, right? On Facebook and Instagram, 59 ads also promoted the narrative that LGBTQ plus community and allies were, quote, grooming children. Meta, the owner of Facebook and Instagram, accepted almost $25,000 for these particular ads, which were seen, or at least served to over 2.1 million times, according to the report, right? So this goes back to something that we've talked about before, where, companies like Facebook, Twitter, Google, they're willing to accept money on the front end. And obviously they do have certain protocols in play to try to prevent this stuff from happening. But they are also very willing to, accept the money up front, run the ads, let people see them, and then realize that maybe they shouldn't have done that, or they get pushback and they take it down and they say, our bad, right? We'll do an internal investigation and figure out how this happened. And how this happened is the same way it always happens, that people were willing to pay for it, right? When we talk about like Russian misinformation or misinformation and disinformation online, it exists because these infrastructures allow it to. It's not as if the Russians like hacked Facebook, right, to put that information, the Russians, quote unquote, Russian agents, better said, put that information on Facebook, right? They're playing the game of Facebook, right? And they're using fake accounts or taking over accounts, of course, right? But they're also using the infrastructure of ads and pages that exist that anybody can use, right? And learn how to essentially game for any purposes that are within Facebook's rules. And obviously Facebook has changed some rules since then, but they also continue to let things like this happen, right? Another example of this, the last one in this category, right, is of course the search by the FBI on former President Trump's home in Florida. And this is a story just from this week about the increase in the use in the conversation about attacks on the FBI, but specifically like civil war, right? So posts on Twitter that mentioned civil war had soared nearly 3,000% in just a few hours as Mr. Trump's supporters blasted the action as a provocation. Similar spikes followed, including on Facebook, Reddit, Telegram, Parler, Gab, and Truth Social, Mr. Trump's own social platform. Mentions of the phrase more than doubled on radio programs and podcasts as measured by Critical Mention, a media tracking firm. So that just illustrates again that this is not just like a social media problem, right? Radio, podcasts, which are obviously a digital media platform in their own right, but it's not just Facebook and Twitter, right? It's also on radio. It's also on cable, right? It's on podcasts. So this is another category of stuff. We've got the big lie related to the 2020 election and everything that comes from that, right? And then the percolating ideas that are, powering in some ways the discourse surrounding this election. And a lot of this stuff is holdover, things that people are always arguing about in one form or another, but things that have real news connected to them, right? A new law, changes or decisions from the Supreme Court and FBI action, but then those results or those events obviously produce tons of misinformation and disinformation about them. So what have the social platforms said they're going to do or are doing leading into this election cycle? The New York Times did a really deep story not too long ago, basically surveying each of the main platforms, right? So, Meta, which owns Facebook and Instagram, Twitter, Google with YouTube, TikTok, right? What are you going to do that's similar to what you were doing before, and what are you going to do that's different? And basically, to a company, if you look at this story, the paragraphs all kind of look like this, right? So the one from the top left here is from Twitter. In a blog post outlining its plans for the midterm elections, Twitter said it would reactivate its civic integrity policy, a set of rules adopted in 2018 that the company uses ahead of elections around the world. Under the policy, warning labels similar to those used by Facebook will again be added to false or misleading tweets about elections, voting, or election integrity. often pointing users to accurate information or additional context. Tweets that receive the labels are not recommended or distributed by the company's algorithm. The company can also remove false or misleading tweets entirely. A newer platform, TikTok, here in a blog post announcing its midterm plans, Eric Hahn, TikTok's head of US safety, said the company would continue its fact-checking program from 2020, which prevents some videos from being recommended until outside fact checkers verify them. It also introduced an election information portal, which provides voter information like how to register 6 weeks earlier than it did in 2020. So a lot more of the same, right? Making the same sort of promises that, and again, I don't want to minimize the work that these companies have to do to try to control the just sheer amount of content that gets placed on their platforms. But given that we've contextualized this as certainly not a shrinking concern of global citizens and users of these platforms, to hear a lot of, well, we're going to keep doing what we've been doing, right? Which often results on the front end, on the public side, as putting that little label at the bottom, right? Or from a TikTok standpoint, from a newer platform, yeah, we're gonna prevent some videos from being recommended. That's it. Not taking them down. We're just some videos, people won't see them, right? And obviously this gets into conversations about free speech and control, if I could talk tonight. And you see this in their individual like posts. I went in to kind of see like, what does this look like, right? So on Facebook, there's a lot of, clean images and illustrations of, hey, if people post something, we're going to label it false information, right? And we're going to eventually probably maybe take it down, right? And will that happen after enough people get mad? Yeah. Can we maybe not do that super well in a group that's private, that doesn't have that same level of moderation? Well, yes, also true. And YouTube, naturally, they don't have a hub. When the New York Times did this story, they were like, well, there's not really one page where they say what they're going to do, but they do have this video, which I thought I would play just a little bit of here before we get any further.
True or false? Telling your viewers you can vote in a presidential election online in countries or regions where that's not allowed can result in your channel receiving a strike or being terminated. The answer is true or false. Telling your viewers you can vote in a presidential election online in countries or regions where that's not allowed can result in your channel receiving a strike or being terminated. The answer is true. Certain types of misinformation that can cause real-world harm go against our community guidelines and are not allowed on YouTube. For example, uploading misleading or deceptive content that interferes with democratic processes can result in a community guideline strike or other consequences for your channel. Let's walk through some of the elections-related content that we don't allow on YouTube. First, content that promotes voter suppression. This includes content that aims to mislead voters about the time, place, means, or eligibility requirements for voting. It also includes content that promotes false claims that strongly discourage voting. Next, content that promotes false claims about candidate eligibility. We don't allow content that advances false claims related to the technical eligibility requirements to serve in office. This includes both current political candidates and sitting elected government officials. The eligibility requirements that are considered are based on applicable national law and include age, citizenship, and vital status. And we don't allow content that encourages viewers to interfere with democratic processes. This includes obstructing or interrupting voting procedures. As with all of our community guidelines, context is very important. If you want to post content on these topics for educational, documentary, scientific, or artistic purposes, sometimes referred to as EDSA, be sure to provide enough information so viewers understand the context. Now that you know some of the elections-related content we don't allow, let's take a look at an example. In one video, a creator uploads a video telling viewers an incorrect voting date. In another video, a news segment covers a story about a group that called voters to say the election was canceled. The news video includes lots of context explaining how the election was actually not canceled. Do either of these videos violate our community guidelines? Yes. The first video violates our elections misinformation policy. We don't allow content that promotes voter suppression. The news segment, on the other hand, gives the audience context and was uploaded for educational, documentary, scientific, or artistic purposes. The safety of our creators.
I'm going to stop it there. What do we think about that? Just how they are publicly explaining how they're going to approach the election. Either, YouTube, Facebook, any of these, the paragraphs we read. Do you feel comforted at all by those explanations or descriptions?
True or false?
Why'd you just step
Telling
in?
your viewer.
Yeah. Right. Right.
Yeah, my concern with that is showing that people who want to spread this information, this is how you work.
Yep, exactly. Here are the ways to seed this in, right? Here are the ways that if you're framing it as if you're approaching this from a news or documentary or art, right? If you're arguing for like creative license, as an artist, what does that mean when that might lead to pretty clear circulation? And as we know, right, YouTube is a big hub for this type of stuff. So it's not as if this is a foolproof plan, right? I also find the thing I struggle with the most is that I understand, oh, there we go. Come back. Oh, I'll hold it. The thing that I struggle with the most is like, wanting to be a proponent of free speech in these platforms, right? Because I think it's really dangerous to, suggest that there's a level of free speech that we should curtail, even if we don't like what people are saying, right? But I also struggle with when these platforms say, like, we take this really seriously. And if you create these videos, for instance, that circulate misinformation or disinformation or try to suppress the vote or interfere with an election, you may get a strike. Like we may take the newspaper and just do a light like tap of the nose, right? That we're not going to kick you off the platform, that we're not going to demonetize your account, that you're just going to get a strike. And they didn't even say like 3 strikes and you're out. Like, what is the strike system? And I think that's a really like tricky place to be. Is I don't want to say that like all these platforms should just be kicking people off because why do we trust these platforms to do anything, let alone like control who, yeah. Ooh.
I said, shoot, oh, I'm not going to and so Facebook, I said, shoot a line.
Right. Yeah, you didn't put a comma. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, we're fine. It just came unplugged. Yeah. Yes. Right. It has certain things that it knows it's supposed to look for, or people, right? And that's the thing. I mean, there's been tons of investigative reporting about, this is all awful for us as consumers. Like, imagine, the people who have worked for these companies as content moderators, like there's tons of reporting about those people literally been driven to suicide by having to see this stuff all the, because what you did is completely innocent and annoying for you, but imagine all the things that people actively try to put on Facebook every single second of every single day. Right. And that's why I always say that we have to turn them off. Like, that our only solution is to turn them off. Like, I feel like a crazy person saying that sometimes, but like, if we want to be proponents of free speech and don't want the companies who can't handle this stuff, as we can see, to be the ones to determine who gets free speech and who doesn't. And we're concerned if somebody like Elon Musk is going to buy Twitter and make it a space that brings, hate speech to the forefront. And like, I get that argument that he's not the person to own one of these companies, but the people who own them now are not the people to own these companies, right? And that just, it's such a difficult situation to be in, to try to determine like how we solve it, right? The next, and this is not brand new, but the next frontier of where this stuff is going, if you think social media is bad, where there's moderation, right, is text messaging, right? Where this is not a new thing, as all of the stuff we discussed is not new, right? But especially in the 2020 election, tons of reporting about, massive increases in text message based misinformation from all of these random kind of automated accounts, right? That, political action groups and campaigns and whatever buy just sets of data. I'm sure we can all, remember even recently, like the text you're getting from various campaigns that you never signed up for, that you don't like, candidates not in Illinois, not in your district, not even in your region, right? And they send you the most annoying, like, the emails are one thing, but the texts are, there's just like, yeah. And they always start with like, I've got some bad news. And you're like, who is texting me? And then you're like, oh, it's Senator John Ossoff or whatever. I'm like, get out of here, right? The next frontier of this is that, folks who are operating in very bad faith, right, are buying up the data sets that have phone numbers and circulating mis and disinformation. So this is just a screenshot from one that, and this is from a post or a Time story from earlier in the fall or late summer, where there was one here about this extended viral clip that I've never seen, right? Which speaks to how these things do go viral, but if you have a certain experience online and on social media, you still don't even see them, right? But on social media, on Facebook and Twitter, I saw that you had millions of impressions, that there was this video and this viral, disinformation about how, you can see here, and during a recent town hall, Joe Biden endorsed giving 8 and 10-year-olds sex change treatment. So this is in the category of, all of the horrible discourse surrounding, transgendered people and trans kids and things like that, right? This is way too extreme for me. I can't support him. Watch the video. And you can see the text actually starts, "Hi, I'm a Democratic volunteer," underlining that even for me as a Democratic volunteer, Joe Biden, who is suggesting that, kids as young as 8 should, get sex change treatments. This was, and there was a 2-minute video that also had millions of views on YouTube, right? And this was going to millions of people via text, right? And what's really tough about this is that there's really not a good way to monitor this, to study it in the same way that you can even things public on Facebook or Twitter, right? And what happens more often than not is when journalists try to cover this stuff, they get caught in this cycle of trying to fact check everything. So when this story happens, this viral video is out there, we see all these texts, there's a few stories about that. Then in and around that time, there's this story about how different companies, private companies, were concerned about misinformation like this coming to your phone in text form about vaccines, right? Similar type of stuff. So then there's all sorts of people, including Joe Rogan, and actually a guest on his podcast. Joe did not, say this directly himself, I guess. It was implied that the government was monitoring texts to try to basically punish people who were sharing misinformation about the vaccines. The original story never said the government was involved. It was only private companies who were, quote unquote, concerned about this misinformation coming via text. And then all the reporting then is about like people talking about how there's an additional conspiratorial level, making things up about text, right? So then suddenly the conversation about disinformation coming to you via text message is now all about trying to deal with disinformation about, in this case, the Biden administration being the ones to surveil, look into your phone data to find this information out. So even when you're trying to cover this stuff, journalists kind of get caught in the loop of dealing with the bad actors or the misinformed who are saying, I heard that the government is just reading your text messages to see if you're lying about COVID or lying about the vaccine, and you're going to get punished for that. That never happened. And there aren't enough articles about just the day-to-day misinformation that we get via text, right? Or even just the spam that we get via text now, right? There's the FTC and FCC, and those organizations are completely just like disempowered to do much about this, right? The other, not new frontier, but a place where this has really increased significantly over the last, I would say, 4 to 6 years, over the last 2 or 3 election cycles. Unsurprisingly, we have a huge growing potential block of voters, right? With the very, very broad, this is part of the reason it's, problematic in the first place, but Latino voters, quote unquote, as a category, right? And obviously there are tons of different types of people who make up that broad category from different backgrounds, from different countries, different parts of the world that we label in the United States as quote unquote Latino, right? Parties in the United States are obviously seeing this growing group of people and trying to get them to their proverbial side for elections. So unsurprisingly, they have become a huge market for misinformation about elections, especially in text form. Actually, there are a number of articles that talk about the overlap between the rise in text message-based misinformation and that text message-based misinformation or disinformation targeted at Latino voters or potentially Latino voters in particular. Biden was hammered for this, and other Democrats were hammered for this in places around the border in Texas and in various places in Florida, where Biden actually underperformed pretty significantly in contrast to Hillary Clinton's 2016 performance, because a lot of this messaging, hammered Biden as a socialist, right? And that struck a chord with Cuban voters in Florida, with immigrants on the border in Texas who came from countries that had, very problematic socialist regimes at various points in their history. And so making that connection to Biden and the Democrats has been a successful tactic, right? And there is a lot of that kind of Spanish language misinformation being targeted at potential Latino voters via text, right? Where it feels a little bit more intimate. You could also say invasive, right? Interestingly, there was a study done to try to kind of understand this a little bit more. And so there was a survey done just of Latino voters, right? And it was a small sample, it's like 2,800 people. And the left-hand side is, have you heard of this stuff, right? Like basically, have you heard of these news items? And you can see, the things that they've heard, right? And then on the right-hand side is how likely they think it's true or false, right? And the more, that bar on the left goes to the left, right? They believe it to be pretty false. And the more it goes to the right, they believe it to possibly be true. And what's been interesting here is that, unsurprisingly, some of the reporting in the media about how all of this misinformation is, targeted at Latino voters and has been convincing. And that's why, for instance, President Trump got more support in Florida or Texas or Nevada than maybe people thought. And it's all been labeled like dis and misinformation, when a lot of these Latinos who were surveyed, unsurprisingly, it's a diverse group of people. They have diverse views. They generally don't believe, for instance, that Trump won the 2020 election. They generally, don't believe that the vaccine is worse than COVID, right? They don't believe, for instance, that the vaccine has a microchip, right? So to some extent, a little bit of the reporting that's been done on this type of misinformation and disinformation falls into some assumptions about Latino voters as this big monolithic group of people, even though, the category of potential voters is like over 60 million, right? So there's going to be diversity of thought in that population. And that doesn't mean that all the ones who, vote for a Republican have been, lied to by misinformation via text. But it's certainly an emerging category. The one thing that I wanted to illustrate of how this is happening, I should have removed that text, but at the last moment here is from this summer. You may have remembered that Kansas had a referendum on abortion, right? That was surprisingly struck down by the citizens of Kansas, which is generally not one of our most conservative states, but a conservative leaning state as far as votes go. And like the night before, you can see here, Kansas, oh man, I can't say that. Kansans. Yeah, I'm putting another S in there. We're set to vote on a historic statewide referendum. Voters saw a lie about how to vote pop up on their phone. A blast of old-fashioned text messages falsely told them that a yes vote protected abortion access in their state, when the opposite was true. A yes vote would cut abortion protections from the state's constitution. They both failed, but the campaign shows how easily a bad actor can leverage text messages, which still rely on the same basic technology from when they were developed in the 1990s to spread disinformation. And now there's a cottage industry and federal agencies that target election disinformation when it's on social media. There's basically no comparable effort to do this, right? It's such a diffuse and old technology that there's no way to really clean it up on a full-scale level. Each of these articles has interviews with scholars who are dis and misinformation experts who focus primarily on social media. And they say, even trying to study it, right? Even trying to get access to some of this material is hard because it's so diffuse, it's so localized. It's so easy, frankly, to send a mass automated number of text messages, right? If you've got a bunch of numbers, it's really not that hard to do. So you can have hyper localized up to the minute moments like this that have misinformation about how to vote and misinformation about, what you're actually voting on. And there's not a lot that can be done about that, right? One final thing here that I think that's worth noting is how polls and polling data in of themselves have become a little bit of misinformation in our current political climate. And this is an unfortunate reality of how polling has evolved over the last few years. It's not that pollsters are operating in bad faith or trying to skew the polls, but if you've paid attention to the last few elections, really going back to 2016, and especially actually in 2020, across the board, the polling data leading into an election has been skewed in favor of Democrats. And, even in cases where Democrats have won states or districts or, the entire country, they have not won at the rate that they were projected to win by polls, right? In 2016, you can see here that pollsters said the problems, their samples included too few voters without college degrees. Then came 2020, which was actually worse than 2016. And pollsters really haven't yet figured out why. There's a lot of discourse about generally there were way more people at home during 2020, and they were, especially, Democrats who generally, in certain cases, are more willing to respond to these surveys, especially at that period when there was a lot of energy to, get Trump out of the White House or whatever. The cross section of Democratic voters who are really into politics, who also have white collar jobs, who were then probably working from home in the lead up of the 2020 election, meant that a lot of those polls were skewed Democrat, but that's also just kind of conjecture, right? People are trying to figure that out. And unsurprisingly, then in the recent weeks, even the New York Times, which has addressed this over the last couple of years, are suggesting that this issue is happening again, right? That if you look at polls as of a couple weeks ago, the 2022 Senate candidates in the main race, kind of important races where it could be potentially close, they've now done the math and said, okay, well, let's say we have the same exact issues in polling, the distance between what the polls say and what the ultimate results are. As 2020, here's what's actually going to happen. And you can see, well, if we stick with that exact same, rate of error, this is what is going to happen, that Republicans would actually, pick up 3 of these races based on the polling. And I mean, that's a little negligible anyway, because North Carolina and Ohio we're polling at such a small, Democratic advantage, but you can see how big of a swing it is, right? That we're talking about the polling saying that Tim Ryan in Ohio is ahead by a little less than a point. But if we use the 2020 outcome as the result, he's actually going to get washed by 7 points, right? And the 2020 error was bigger than the 2016 error. So there's thoughts that, oh boy, is the 2022 error going to be even bigger than the 2020 error? But weirdly, there wasn't as big of an issue in the 2018 polling. So there is some thought that Trump is, sort of the big, the weird element, right? With him on the ballot, that creates a completely different dynamic that we'll have to see. But I think the thing that this illustrates is that real legitimate data is not necessarily as tactile and true as we want it to be, right? Where this type of information that circulates all the time related to elections it's not theoretical. It's more than theoretical, but it's also not totally tangible, as we see all the time, that the polls are not what actually is going to happen, despite how high tech and data driven, these processes can be now, and how great these charts look when all the news organizations put them out there, that even when people are acting in good faith, this stuff can become misinformation, right? And what it means. So as always, I like to think about, well, what do we do? So I went and looked at a bunch of different sources, like, how do we deal with this? How do you talk to people? And what's funny is I find these to be so facile in contrast to the issues that we face, right? So, one of them suggested, like, if you're going to talk to people, you need to relate to them on emotional friendship level first. You don't want to just hit them with facts. You don't want to become too emotional if they disagree with you. You want to try, if you're trying to convince somebody of something online, don't overwhelm them again with paragraphs and paragraphs of information. Potentially ask them, where did you learn that? To talk to them about, sources and credibility. Try to get them to talk about, like, why that source might be funded by a particular political action group, or have an agenda that might be economic in nature. But then there are some that are like, you just got to set the record straight, right? You just got to tell people the way that it is. These are the facts. So, and some of these come from the same sources, right? So they're even contradictory in what they're suggesting. Be willing to walk away, not getting into these heated arguments. And then trying to remember that changing minds takes time, right? That one post is not going to convince everybody. So before we move on to the last thing that I had, which circles back to something Lee said earlier, what do we think about these as suggestions of how to combat misinformation and disinformation in our own circles? Do these seem remotely useful to you? Yeah. Other thoughts? Yeah.
In the spring, I'm running in Washington, but I did work in the spring in Washington. And I think there it was interesting because Terry finally switched to paper ballots, switched back to paper ballots.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it was, I would do that from the bush, it's safer, it's,
Yeah. All the discourse about the rigged voting machines no longer in the same way. Yeah. Right. Right. It's not a Wi-Fi issue. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah.
I don't know. They just, some people just don't want to have the money change.
Right. Absolutely. Yes. Right. Right.
But people,
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Well, and it feels so, to me, it just feels so facile of someone who's always thinking about this and is nominally here to like help people work through these issues. Like, I think part of what I view my responsibility is as in doing that is illustrating that like there's not a way to fix this, right? Like on some level, there's so many things, there we go again, that are broken about this system that make it impossible for us. And not that we would ever change it on an like as individuals, right? But even that case, right, that when you're in that moment with somebody who has potentially been in the ecosystem in their everyday lives, online, whatever, where they're surrounded by this stuff and have been, pick your date for however long, right? What is one well-meaning volunteer's clear-headed, fact-based description gonna do? Nothing, right? And I think about that all the time when it's just like, well, you know, keep your messages short, be calm. And it's like, it does take forever to change people's mind. And we don't have that time, right? Like that's the scary thing, is that it just doesn't, we're so far beyond having enough time to be able to like, not even go back, but go forward to a world where people are willing to agree upon basic facts, right? That we're in an environment now where no matter like your ideological beliefs, right, that people who run for office for one political party see it politically pertinent. Like, I don't actually think most of those people believe that the 2020 election was faulty in any way, right? But they believe it politically valuable to say, well, of course I have questions, right? And they are never going to stop saying that, right? Every single election from here until the end of whatever system we have right now, there are going to be people who now say, well, of course I didn't lose, right? It was rigged, something happened, I'm calling for a recount. Like, we're never going back to, because if you're running for office in a party that has made that, right now at least, a normal thing to say, why would you say otherwise? Why would you get in public and say, actually, I lost, I was a bad candidate, right? I didn't do well, right? I didn't fundraise enough money, when it's just so much easier to say, I don't know, you know, what about the voting boxes or the procedure? Maybe we should roll back voting rights. I'll take the L. I lost, but in 2 years or in 4 years, we're going to make sure that the next candidate, this doesn't happen to them. AKA, we're going to make it even harder to vote, right? I just find it hard to then, you know, convince a normal person, a person who's not a politician, right, of this kind of stuff, right? And that becomes really challenging in online, in person. All these, you know, advice guides and things like that say talking to people in person, like online, is never going to be the solution. And I agree with that. But as we talked about last time, like, we also do increasingly now, even more, like, self-select the type of people that we want to be around, right? Where the moment where you might encounter people who strongly disagree with you the most is like at election day, when you're standing next to them or handing them a ballot to vote, right? You might not encounter them or have the opportunity to have these type of conversations every day, right? And who actually does want to, right? Often, as we talked about last time, like, you don't want to just talk about the election with people in your lives, right? Like, it's annoying, right? For better, for worse, right? One thing to put a button on this, to something we talked about earlier, is how do we combat this? There was an interesting survey done where people were asked, do you agree or disagree with this statement? Overall, I trust the process for counting votes in our elections. Okay. And initially, 63% of people in that poll, and obviously a small, you know, sample size, et cetera, said they did, right? 63. Honestly, my reaction to that was like, that's pretty good in 2022 America, 63%. So, but then when another group of voters was asked the same question after reading a statement that included things like political candidates can challenge election results. But when another group was asked the same question after reading a statement that included things like political candidates can challenge election results, but our system requires proof in following the law, and let's keep improving our elections and make them fair, equal, and transparent. That number went up 70 to 72% of voters, right? So what they were suggesting here is that, you know, after hearing the affirmative narrative, even Republican voters were in the double-digit points more likely to say they trust the process for counting votes in elections. So this is in some ways underlining this idea that the constant refrain about like elections being under attack has like weirdly created a dynamic where people don't want to hear about it, right? They don't want to hear about this. If you go further down, those same voters responded poorly to messaging that tried to persuade them of impending threats to democracy, including, for instance, fact-based reporting on the number of restrictive voting bills that have been introduced over the past 2 years in states across the country. People were turned off and they were like, well, that's Democratic talking points, and that's too negative and things aren't that bad, right? So there's a really interesting thing happening here, perhaps not surprising, that people like don't want to think about the current real state of things that are happening all across the country, right? And when you frame it to them as actually, you know, we're always working on improving our voting systems, they feel more confident about the process. The problem, of course, is that that phrasing is completely detached from reality on some level, right? That we do have more restrictive voting bills that have been passed in 18 states over the last 2 years, right? And so the challenge is that even when you give people fact-based information, to go back to something you said at the very beginning of today's session, they immediately say, well, that fact-based relaying of reality of something that generally Republican legislatures have done across the country, well, that's a Democratic talking point, right? So all of this is completely ideological, even when you try to just ask people like, do you think we have a good election system or not, right? So positivity maybe works more than trying to like argue with people, but that also requires you to ignore large chunks of reality to have that conversation with people, right? Like I don't need to make that ideological, but it is, right? The people doing this more often than not have represented one party over the other. That's just a fact. And that doesn't mean that, you know, all Republicans are bad and the Democrats are good. That's not what I'm saying. But if you're trying to have that conversation with people, this one sample says, well, maybe make it more positive. So I don't know. Do we feel like that is a strategy? Does that convince anybody of anything, that if you're more positive about the potential changes, like I don't want to hammer you with how bad it is, but I want to maybe talk about like how we could do it better. Does that seem like a valuable strategy? Yeah. Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah. Right. 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 Right.
You know, I was trying to be very positive about the change and, you know, and that and something like that.
Yeah. Right. Right. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that, yeah, and then you get kind of stuck in it, I would feel the same way, but it's like there's almost like a fetishization of the process, right? Like you want to encourage, because it's hard to convince people to change their mind ideologically, then we're just stuck in the middle, just saying like, well, vote, like you got to vote, you know, you got to participate in the process.
Yeah.
And that's what matters, even if like as a result you potentially bring in more people who actually have tons of mis and disinformation in their head, which is democracy. That's always been the case. But I think that's like where we're stuck too, is it just feels like, you know, if we view this ideologically, and, you know, the Democrats obviously have been far more at banging the drum that we need, you know, to combat these issues, as we talked about I think last time, like, Obama has spent a lot of time in his post-presidential life talking about the impact of mis and disinformation. But they never really do anything about it because there's only so many things that they can even do without, again, as we always say, like going to Zuckerberg and saying, you're going to prison forever and we're hitting the big red button on your companies, right? Right. And so because they can't totally do anything about it, they often then just say like, well, the way we fix this is that we get more people to vote, right? And that also getting more people to vote has literally nothing to do with this, right? Because if most of those people, or even a small chunk of those people, are folks who are in, misinformation ecosystems, what does that solve, right? That doesn't solve this. It's, we have more people engaged in the process. That is a positive, but that doesn't mean that those folks will have their minds changed away from mis and disinformation, right? Yes. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think that trickles into news, right? And I've said this before. I have it different, especially the last couple elections, have been the type of person who like every day is like checking, are there new polls? Like, what do the polls tell us? Like completely out of my mind, like this, what's going on in Iowa. I can tell you it's 6 points, right? And then just realizing after the last election, it's just like, this is hokum, right? This is just numbers on a chart that's nicely presented to me by the New York Times. And this is not the fault of that's not what I'm saying. That's easy for me to say like, okay, I have mental control over a process that I have zero control over because all I do is I'm one vote, right? And this section today, doing this research for this, I was like, that's what's going on in Colorado or whatever. In the last 2 or 3 elections, I would have been able to tell you who the candidates were, what they were polling, they're at, and I've just decided like, I cannot do this, right? Because it is rife with mis and disinformation, even coming from people who are trying to circulate the right stuff or trying to contextualize this with data, because it is just all, we don't know, but news in some ways, and we talk about how this stuff is all interconnected. They want to convince people that they feel like they want to convince their readers or their listeners that they are the experts, and numbers help with that and charts help with that, to be able to say, here's what we know, here's what we think we know based on historical patterns, where the last few elections have illustrated a lot of swings away from, the fundamentals, as they call it in polling, right? That the fundamentals say that this is happening with the economy. So that means the Democrats are done, right? That they control all 3, the House, the Senate, and the White House. So they're screwed because of inflation. Maybe not, right? For a million different reasons, right? And I think that just means that you ultimately, even as someone who studies, teaches this stuff, yeah, I'm out. I just can't do it, right? Yeah. Anything else? We should promote our other event from October 24th. Yep. Yeah.
Come out. Dr. Barker will be there to talk about all of this and more, and how to wade through all of the misinformation when you're trying to make decisions to vote.
Yeah.
And we'll also have Curator Election Commission will be there to show kind of a sample ballot and how this all works.
Yeah.
Try to take the scariness away,
Demystify. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, well, okay. There we go. Yeah. So that's October 24th. Great. 5:30. Right. So share it, to anybody that you know. Yeah, that would be great. And then we'll meet again next month, of course, for our session here. And in that session, we're going to talk a little bit more about the way in which the culture war button just gets hit like every single day, and why we're all just so mad all the time, and how the internet and social media obviously play into that, but you know, the ways in which news organizations, politicians, whomever also facilitate that. And then then we'll be headed into December, where we'll do a little bit of a wrap up and try to think a little bit more deeply about what we do. How do we get better at this, given all of these external factors that we cannot control? And maybe we'll have better things to say than you know, stop reading or throw our phones in the ocean or whatever, right? Which sometimes I think is what we should do, right? All right, folks, thank you so much. Thanks for anybody who's watching after the fact online. We'll see you next month.